Welcome to the Marvel Mindset, a podcast from ex-Marvel CEO Peter Cuneo. Listen as Peter shares inside stories of what it took to turn around Marvel. Here's your host, Peter Cuneo.
Well, welcome back, everyone. This is episode 8 of the Marvel Mindset. And today we're going to continue talking about the strategic decisions that Marvel made that were so important to Marvel's turnaround and its ultimate huge success. There are 3 areas that I'd like to talk about today. The first is, how did Marvel see the internet? What were some of the discussions, debates in some cases, about how we might or might not have used the internet? And also about how other people related to us were using the internet, which I'll get into in a little bit. The second item that I want to talk about is basically how we fixed our capital structure. This is a story that is not well known. In fact, almost nobody knows about it, yet it was so important to Marvel's success. And I want to talk about that in a minute. I have mentioned in the past that our capital structure coming out of bankruptcy was not right for the business, only right for what the creditors would agree to. And we had to fix that. And I'll get into that. It's quite a story, actually. And we could not have been successful without this particular action that we took. And then finally, I want to talk about how important assembling our board of directors was. I'm a big believer in a very, very active board. And we'll talk about the pluses and minuses of that. But Marvel had a great board, and I want to get into that in some detail. They were a very important part of our success. Okay, let's talk about the internet. The internet was, of course, very new when I came to Marvel in 1999, just starting to get on its feet. But one of the big issues had to be, did we want to sell our own products, whether they were media or consumer products, over the internet? There was a lot of debate inside the company and in general in the business world. Would consumers actually buy products directly from the internet? Or did they need to always feel the product in a retail environment? So in our case, we certainly looked at the opportunities to do something on the internet. But there was a lot of debate back and forth. And the board and I felt very strongly that we were playing with fire if we started selling on the internet our products that were also on retail shelves. Would we charge less money for the same product, the same or more? In truth, it didn't matter. We really felt we would alienate overnight our retail customers. They would feel that we are selling against them. So someone like Walmart wouldn't be happy with us, and it could really hurt our business. So in the end, with regard to the internet in the sense of selling products, we basically stepped aside. And we didn't pursue that. The other big issue that we had on the internet were Marvel influencers. As Marvel began to take off, a lot of fans were creating their own websites devoted to Marvel. There were discussion points about Marvel. What do you think of the movies? What do you think of the comic books? What should Marvel be doing here? What do you like about Marvel? All of these things. And there were quite a few of these sites. And these sites, unfortunately, because they're not lawyers, were using some of our intellectual property, showing the comic books, showing other art that they had basically borrowed from other online sources or taken photographs of other stuff, and were using that. Now, technically, that's illegal. When you're going to use somebody else's intellectual property, the representations of that property, normally, you would have to go to the company to get permission to do that. The fanboys, the fangirls that were creating these influencer sites, and they were popping up almost every day, were not lawyers. They were not sophisticated in that regard, and they didn't know that they had to do that. Our lawyers were very concerned because if you let people use your IP for any extended period of time, there's a theory in the legal world that you actually lose the IP. But the idea of Marvel going after well-meaning people, fans, who are actually providing, in effect, free advertising for the company. The idea of us actually going after them really turned me off. I just didn't want to alienate well-meaning fans who were attracting other fans every day with their websites. In the end, we decided to let people know that technically they needed our permission to use some of the materials they were doing, but we were not going to go after them. Not at all. These are people that are actually helping us, that loved Marvel. The last thing we wanted to do was come on to them in a negative way. So that's kind of the two big issues we had initially on the internet. Both of those things worked out for themselves. Our strategy was a do-nothing strategy on the internet, at least initially. Some years later, that changed a little bit. But we were never super active on the internet. I've talked in previous episodes about the fact that our capital structure was, frankly, very onerous for us. And I'd say the biggest problem we had is that we had come out of bankruptcy with $250 million of what's called high yield debt. And high yield debt simply means debt at a high interest rate. In this case, the $250 million was at 12%. So we were required to come up with $30 million in cash to pay interest every year. And you'll recall that I've mentioned how cash poor we were and how we were very cash sensitive on virtually everything that we were doing. So while we didn't have the cash to pay the interest, this debt also allowed us to do what's called pay in kind. And that means instead of paying the interest in cash, you could pay the interest with another asset. Well, the other asset we could pay in was Marvel stock. So on the day the interest was due, we do a calculation of what the price was on Marvel stock and calculate the number of shares that were needed to meet that dollar obligation. And we would, if you will, transfer the stock to the shareholders. That's helpful, but the reality is paying in kind has also got problems. Paying in stock has problems. One thing was that we'd be issuing a lot of stock because the stock of Marvel was still down quite a bit. And so you're paying out a lot of shares. And what was actually happening is that the current shareholders, and remember, Marvel is trading on the New York Stock Exchange, the current shareholders were being what we call diluted. It's very simple. There are more shares outstanding. With Marvel having the same value, that simply means that the value of the stock is going to go down when you do that. So while it gave us temporary relief, if you will, it was still problematic paying in stock. A quick pause now, and I'll pick things up when we return. But here's the really unique part of this story. Isaac Perlmutter, who was the largest shareholder, the controlling shareholder in Marvel, and by the way, later on became the largest shareholder in Disney, did something extraordinary. I have to say that knowing Ike was always a risk taker. So we wanted to get another loan to replace this loan at a lower interest rate. But again, Marvel's financial situation was such that we were not going to get a low interest rate. But Ike Perlmutter personally guaranteed a very large loan to a well-known bank. So we were able to get the lower interest rate. But basically what that meant was if Marvel failed and didn't pay back the loan, he was going to have to pay back the loan personally. A tremendous risk on his part, but one he was willing to take, and of course worked out in the end very, very well for him. But he still took a big, big risk in personally guaranteeing a very large loan, well over $100 million. So what we did, because the high yield debt was trading at a very low price, was trading at 52 cents. So what that means in the world of bonds is that while the debt was originally at, say, $1 for the bond, you could buy the bonds now for only 52 cents. That means the bonds had lost 48% of their value. And that's again reflection of the bondholders being very afraid for Marvel's future, thinking might very well go back into bankruptcy and willing to sell those bonds at a huge discount to what they originally paid. So we were able to buy in those $250 million in bonds for about $130 million. And we were able, using the proceeds from that guaranteed loan, to retire all of those bonds. So we basically eliminated $30 million in interest every year, interest that we couldn't afford to pay. Now, we did have a new loan, but it was at a much lower interest rate because of Ike Perlmutter's personal guarantee. And of course, eventually, in a couple of years, we were able to pay off that loan as well. But if he had not stepped up to basically guarantee that loan, I'm not sure what would have happened to Marvel in the future. It's a very big story that you never hear anything about. The other thing I'd like to talk about today, the other important part of the Marvel story, the Marvel success, was our board of directors. We had an all-star board of directors. Some were there when I first came to the company, some were added later. We had added expertise in finance, expertise in making films, and so on and so forth. We also had a number of turnaround executives like myself on the board, which was very helpful to me because we tend to think alike. And so that worked very well for me personally. We had a great board chaired by Mort Handel. Mort was the chairman for the whole 10 years that I was there up until the sale to Disney. Mort had a great power to handle many disparate personalities. We had a lot of passion on the board. We had an active board. This is not a passive board that just agrees to whatever the management team wants. Not at all. They would question everything. And I think that was very important. So we had the power of their thinking, their experience to add to our own when we were thinking about strategy and tactics for that matter. I always looked at our board as very, very inexpensive help. If you look at the board members' histories, where they'd been successful, how much money they'd made and been paid, what we were paying them to be on the board in terms of board fees and so on was tiny compared with what they were used to making. Yet we were getting the benefit of all their experience and their dedication to Marvel. We had as I said, very passionate board. Everyone was happy to speak their piece. My experience with other boards, some of them is very bad. They're very passive. Basically, it was a social meeting for the most part, board members. And we didn't get much value, if any value, out of the boards in other places I had been. But here they were very passionate. And I'm reminded of one incident, which I always tend to think about it every time I'm asked to give a speech or be on television. Early on coming to Marvel, and this was probably in the year 2000, I was asked to go on one of the well-known streaming, cable platforms for finance and to talk about Marvel and what we were doing. And I was told that I would get 5 minutes on air. And so I was very careful. There were 2 messages I wanted to get across to the audience. Very, very important. And I rehearsed this in my head over and over again. 5 minutes was easy. I could do it in 3. Anyway, I went on camera and the hosts asked me what was frankly a stupid question, had nothing to do with Marvel. But okay, I wanted to be liked by them. So I responded to the question, watching the clock. And fine, no problem. I still had plenty of time. I only needed 3 minutes to do it. Their next question was equally bad, equally off the mark. I didn't even know what they were talking about. They had me mixed up with another company. That's how bad it was. But trying to be nice, again, I basically tried to give them some kind of answer about how this wasn't Marvel and so on. But I'm watching the clock. I can still remember it's right behind their heads on the wall. 3 minutes, I'm ready to go now. Now I'm going to do it. And suddenly they say, Peter, thank you very much for being on. When I got back to my office, I can't quote some of the board members that called me, but let's suffice to say, they were pretty mad at me. I had blown an opportunity to really promote the company, and I'd looked silly. And you know what? They were right. And I appreciated it. I knew it already, but I appreciated the calls anyway. Again, given the words that were used, I couldn't quite quote them, but very passionate board, not afraid to speak their mind on issues. Very, very important for a turnaround situation and really for any board, really. We owe a lot to the Marvel board. They are unsung. They'll never get the credit that they really deserved. Thank you all for joining us. Our next chapter 9, we're going to be talking about the sale of the company, and we're going to be talking about Marvel's numbers, what they were when I came to the company, and what they were many years later. I think you're going to be quite surprised at some of them. They're all obviously very positive, so I'm very happy to discuss them. But that'll be our next episode, episode 9. Thanks again. I'm Peter Cuneo.